It is my honor to introduce Dr. Melissa Hutchinson. Melissa has worked at a local Seattle teaching facility for the past 23 years, with the past 17 as a clinical nurse specialist. Her specialties include a variety of critical care topics, including wound care, cardiac, and palliative care. She is a new part-time adjunct faculty member at Seattle Pacific University for the Doctorate of Nursing Practice Clinical Nurse Specialist program. Melissa obtained several degrees from the University of Washington, Bachelor of Arts in International Business and Marketing, Masters of Nursing, and a Doctorate of Nursing Practice. Both her MN and DNP are as a clinical nurse specialist. Melissa also serves on several nursing professional boards and has published on a variety of topics, including wound care, resuscitation practice, and critical care topics. So without any further ado, I will go ahead and pass it over to Melissa. Melissa, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate that. So I'm Melissa, and I just want to have a little disclosures here of I am an employee at a local Seattle hospital, which shall not be named. We do utilize the Zoll products and software that I'll be presenting here. And the information that I'm presenting is my personal opinion and mine alone, of course, not that of Seattle Pacific University, which I'm adjunct faculty, or the facility where I work full time. And I do have no relevant conflicts of interest. So our objectives today are to identify important data processing or data for process improvement, describe really our journey of how we had our successes and challenges in making our changes to resuscitation improvement, and assess what data points can be utilized to improve outcomes and performance for your inpatient cardiac arrest patients, and identify technological advances that can help improve cardiac arrest outcomes. So over the years, there's been numerous movies about how computers would change and even run our lives. And we kind of feel that way at the moment, don't we? Since we're all stuck at home, well, to some extent. Movies have opened our eyes and imaginations to what machines and computers could do for us someday, we thought. Ready Player One, one of my favorite, War Games, and even one of the very first, 2001: A Space Odyssey. If some of you can think back to Hal's voice from 2001, and the thought of computers assisting our everyday lives, this is no longer novel. We are living it. It is our reality. It's actually quite frightening not to have a computer easily accessible. We go into withdrawal if our phone's not available, or computer, anything that's electronic. Well, this doesn't always carry over to everything we do in the hospital situation. Most of our medical documentation is electronic, except one of our most critical processes, which is resuscitation documentation. So technology has developed at astounding rates, as we've witnessed in the last 10 years with changes in our iPhones, for example. Yet our technology has not really assisted us in decreasing our survival to discharge rates. We're still only averaging about 17 to 20% survival to discharge. We need to do better. And maybe we just aren't using our technology to its full capacity. So what would that look like if we did that? I'm really fortunate to live in a city where we do have high survival to discharge rates. For VFib, VTAC, our survival to discharge rates are around 54% for the Seattle area. We have amazing Medic One. We're very fortunate to have that in our area. And we have lots of training for lay people and hospital personnel on good resuscitation techniques. But the facility where I practice, amazing. We have great resuscitation outcomes, which average above 30%, oftentimes up to 55%. Sometimes we dip a little closer in the 20s, really depending on our patient population for that point. So how can we use our technology to improve our survival to discharge rates? What do we need to do? We have continuous improvement processes, we have code training, we have resuscitation events, and some of these are great options, but we really need accurate data to determine how to change outcomes. If you don't have good data, you can't make those incremental changes that may lead to those significant positive improvements. So when we look at data, people usually have a decent grasp on the 10,000 foot view, you know, the big overview of the trees. but they have the important actions like shock timing, making sure somebody's on the chest and doing continuous compressions, when are medications we're giving generally. But there are less obvious pieces to this puzzle. These pieces may even be more important to changing our outcomes. This less obvious data that's present, but often hides, often in plain sight, and must be to be recognized. It must be collected and organized and viewed. You must be aware of its presence in order to act and create change. Just as you now see the owl and the bird in this picture, the giraffe, however big, can still hide in plain sight if you're really not looking for it. So how do we look below the trees and get to this hidden data? To improve our outcomes, we need to use our technology. We have to use it to its full capability, which we are not doing nationwide. We need to uncover this data to determine what really happened and not just what people can remember happening. You lose that over time, and then you lose those valuable small pieces that you can put into place to make change. To improve what data we assessed, we had to change how it was collected. That was our goal. How are we collecting it? How do we bring it back? How do we look at it afterwards to figure out how can we make changes? So one of our first actions was to actually change the role within our code team. We elevated the role of the code recorder because they're one of the most important people in gathering this information for us. So we wanted to make sure that they could collect everything effectively. We really partner them right next to the leader so that they can have that communication and make sure that we're not missing critical pieces. So prior to changing how our recorder captured code information, you might have seen something like this. Look familiar to anybody else? If you can find anything useful in this documentation, that's great. But it's kind of an expedition to dig for anything in here. And for many years, we had documentation that looks similar to this. And at the moment, we do again, and I'll explain that a little bit later. And in some places in the country, you can actually still see documentation similar to this, unfortunately, but we need to change it. So really, admit it. How many people have done this too? How many people have documented on something like this, or on a paper towel, your scrub pants? That's really hard to decipher, I have to tell you, or a window that might be handy nearby. I've done all of them. So full disclosure, that's me. It happens. People really want to do the right thing. We want to document so that we can pull that information. Really, your focus is bringing the patient back to life, but you really want to document so that you can look at how do we make this not happen again. And sometimes our systems, our situations, and our equipment get in the way of making this a reality. With appropriate systems, this would not be how most people would choose to document. Although I have heard sometimes that, well, you know, some data is better than none. Well, that's kind of true, but if you can't do anything with it and it doesn't allow for adequate review and course changes, maybe that's not the right thing. Just a thought. So for instance, on this one, how do you look at what the chest compression fraction is? How do we know how long they were on the chest? How long were they off the chest? What are the pre-shock pauses? What are the post-shock pauses? Well, these are critical elements that are not clearly documented. And improving our time citations and tracking of these critical elements for resuscitation documentation is something that we have to do. One prospective study demonstrated that when an electronic format was used, our time discrepancies were noted to be off by only an average of 3 seconds. Amazing, right? 3 seconds. Yet, when you use a written format instead, our time discrepancies were off by an average, not the low end, but the average of 77 seconds. P was equal to 0.001. So pretty good information that we should not be using a written format. We know that a delay in defibrillation of even a minute can reduce your survival rates from 39% to 22%. Yet our paper documentation makes identifying these time intervals very difficult, if not impossible. So most healthcare data is electronic, or almost there for electronic, except for our real critical events like resuscitation. Resuscitation documentation still is in the beginning stage in most areas of the country. I'm fortunate in our institution that we realized over about 10 years ago with a little bit of prodding was that we needed an electronic recording system. It was really necessary if we wanted to get to that data and if we wanted to be able to make changes in how we were practicing. And I use the motto over and over again, garbage in, garbage out. If we don't have the right information in, we can't get the right information out to make change. So enter our first code writer currently, but this was our CodeNet. Yes, it was a Nokia phone. It was in the stages when people really didn't have cell phones. So there was some challenges all around that, just getting people to work with the device. How do I push the buttons? Where do I go? How do I get back to home? So that was quite an interesting event all by itself. This was actually the model we used. This was mine. And we were able to train people eventually, and people got more comfortable with it. Most people did. Of course, now we're in the age of iPhones, and it's much easier to get people to buy into this because you have it attached to you at all times during the day. It's not any different than, you know, texting your friends. You kind of get into, I understand how to push the buttons. I understand how to get around, and I'll show you the current version as well, so you can get an idea of what that looks like. These were some of our reports when it was fully functional, and I'll explain that in a minute too. These were the reports that we would show during our interprofessional code review. So we would look at the information, we'd be able to see where the drugs were given, where the defib was charged, where you had your shocks. And we actually used this for quite a while and for good information with that. About 2 to 3 years ago, our system failed. Oh my gosh, it was life-altering for me. And we were unable to repair it and make it functional. So it was very distressing, and I didn't really have any options to figure out how to make it work. We tried, but we had some internal computer system challenges that really led to barriers in getting it up and running. So what we really needed was to upgrade our recording system. We had defibs that were coming to their end of life, and so it was a great opportunity to purchase new defibs and roll that in with the code writer and the wireless platform. So we've been doing that over this past year. We have our defibrillators in-house and close to rolling out probably within the next couple of weeks. And recording should begin, training for recording should begin probably, I'm hoping by March. It's very challenging to do it in the COVID environment, honestly. Since we can't get groups together to practice, it's very difficult to do the training, and I need them to do the hands-on just to get a feel of what to do. So we're aiming for March really is what I'm hoping for go live. Not having this capability for the last couple of years was really a point of frustration for the entire interprofessional team of not having the data we used to have. You really don't realize what you've had until it's gone. And that's what we learned in this. And it was a really tough lesson for us. So this is another example of one of the reports that you could see that shows you your pre-shock pause and your post-shock pause and where you might have some issues. So these are much older reports. These are not current reports that you would see with the new versions. These are some that you would have seen in our version quite a few years ago. Here's, one of the other ones that you get your performance report. You can see where the shocks took place, how often you were in target, and just giving some general overview information. This is the code writer updated version. Very user-friendly, kind of looks like your cell phone, your iPhone, and all your apps, right? So much more friendlier for people, especially our younger generation of nurses who end up being our recorders, to pick up and use with very little training for the most part, because it's very intuitive for them. They have the CPR timer, there's an epi timer, there's a shock timer, if you need it too, number of shocks that are given, and it works very, very great. So you can hit your start button here, and here's your different options here. The part we really utilize down here is our code summary and our code quality issues. So it allows for documentation of what happens in that hot debrief, so that we can capture that information immediately, along with names and signatures. How many people have seen a written code record and you have no idea who the recorder was? I think we all have medical handwriting, and deciphering that lately, since we're all computerized, has gotten a little bit more challenging. So for me, this is invaluable because now I know who to go back to, or I will know who to go back to and ask questions when I need clarification. So I'm going to show you a video. Now, this is what we're hoping. Wait, where did it go? Okay, here's your video. So this is what you will see. We used to do this in our code reviews. We'd play our video. This is a current one. So you can see the IV's already in place. You can see the compressions actually in action. We're holding compressions here. We have VFib. You can tell that the defib was already pre-charged. So they were waiting for hands off chest on the VFib, and shock was provided, and then they're immediately back on chest. So we're looking at, oh, maybe a second or two, time off chest to shock to back on. Okay, so full disclosure, this is a mock situation, and we know in reality it probably wouldn't happen that fast. We could wish that it would, but sometimes it does not. What it does show you is that they did pre-charge the defibrillator, which is what we've also been advocating and teaching. They pre-charged it. As soon as they came off the chest, they were able to verify that they had VFib and it was a shockable rhythm and able to shock. As soon as that was done, they're back on the chest. And you can totally see that play out in front of you. When we had a working, when ours was working and we could watch our videos, that's exactly what we did. We'd gather as a group, we'd put it on the big screen, and we'd press play. And we could see what was happening. How long were you off the chest? Did you pre-charge? And what other issues were happening? So it's much easier to pick up that discrete information. You can actually watch the video in front of you and basically play it back of what the event happened in actual time. It's not condensed or anything. It's actually your actual time. So for CodeNet, our practice improvements, I wanted to talk about what this led to for our group. So for us, it led to team role changes. We realized that to improve our data collected, we had to change our roles, and I spoke about our recorder already. So we wanted to make sure that information was really effectively collected. The other role we actually added was called an operations nurse, who's one of our ICU nurses, and they basically act as your kind of your gatekeeper and coordinator of activities. So do you need an IO? Is there a backboard place? They're looking for those small details that sometimes get overlooked when the leader is focusing on what's happening. Why is this patient dead, and how can I make them come back to life? So that's their job. We want them to do that. And so the operations nurse takes a little bit of that activity off so that they can focus on really what's going on and what's the cause. We looked at decreasing our time to first shock. So as we moved to collect more accurate data, we found our time to first shock was not always as expeditious as we would have liked it to have been, even in our ICUs, which we thought was really interesting because we kind of thought that was a no-brainer, but you should never really think that because things happen. So we reassessed our process for determining a shockable rhythm and discovered that our AED wasn't being fully utilized. So we have the R series and we use the AED mode, and then we go into manual mode once the code team gets there. So when a code was called, the nurses were usually really focused on getting things done. So getting the backboard, getting the crash cart, getting your IV access, that sometimes a shockable rhythm got overlooked, even when the pads were in place. And we could see this actually on the playback when we were watching the videos. We're like, that looks like a VFib. Where is the shock? What happened? And we could tell that nothing was charged. There was no pre-charge, and it was probably overlooked. And we actually found that from people who are participating as well. They could reflect that back to us of, wow, we were really focused on getting things going that we missed that. So we talked about, okay, how do we fix that? So our goal was place your pads first, get them on, get the backboard, start compressions, but we need those pads. So the pads go on, AED goes on, and we let the AED talk. We wanted to take that away from the staff So they didn't have to focus on, oh my gosh, is that asystole? Is it fine VFib? Is it VFib? What do we do? We didn't want anybody to have to focus on that. So give it to the AED, and we did. So basically for the first 5 to 7 minutes until the code team gets there, it takes about 5 minutes for the code team to completely arrive. We let the AED talk, and we haven't had any delays in recognition and shock for a shockable rhythm. It also took a lot of the fear factor away from our staff, our floor staff nurses, who are really anxious around electricity, go figure. So by setting up the AED and saying, let it do its job. If it's shockable, you just push the red button. It's not going to shock when it's not supposed to. It made them much more comfortable, and they were ready to do that. And I watched it actually happen in action as I was doing a review with some staff nurses on a Wednesday. So Wednesday night we talked about it. I'm like, okay, grab a crash cart, get your pads on, off we go. Do that first. Then turn on the AED, let it talk to you. When it says analyzing patient, step away. When it's done, go back and start your compressions. If it tells you you need a shock, then shock them. You can do that. Do that before the team arrives. And the next day, probably in the afternoon, there was a code on the unit that I was actually giving the instruction to. Two of the nurses that were with me when we were going over the review said, grab the crash cart, we need to get the pads on. So of course they did. Pads are on. It said analyzing rhythm, it said shock advised. And they're like, hey, we can shock. So they shocked. Back on to compressions, they're waiting for the code team. We're still not there. And it said analyzing rhythm, shock advised. Off they went again, shocked. By the time we got there, the patient had converted. They had a rhythm with a pulse, and the patient was kind of a little groggy, which is really unusual because you don't always see that. And of course, the code team's first response was, why'd you call it code? And the staff were like, woohoo, we're rock stars. We shocked him twice and he came back. So there was a big celebration with that group of, look at what we did. We saved this patient. We got his heart going again before the code team even got here to rescue us. So they were really jazzed about what they could actually do on their own before we got there. And let me tell you, the patient walked out 5 days later and he was a happy guy. So we watched some of our changes play out in action, and it's amazing when you can see it so close to training and then to an event that actually changed because of that. The other thing that we did too was what we call a code whisperer. So 2020 advocates for a CPR coach. So the coach is the new role within the resuscitation team. It's designed to help promote delivery of high quality CPR and allow the team leader to focus on the elements of the event and coordinate various team members' assigned tasks, that kind of thing. So again, takes a little bit of the role off the leader so that they can focus on what's going on with the patient and how do we bring him back. So we started what we call the code whisperer about 12 or so years ago. It kind of blends together after being at my facility for 23 years, but probably about the right time. This wasn't a recommendation at the time, but it was something that we found was really helpful because we do have residents, and there can be times where it's, your resident's first week as a resident, and, a month ago they were a med student. So you want to be there to support them. So we would stand behind them and provide help, assistance. Have you looked at your HSNTs? What do you think is happening? What are we missing? Do we have an IV in? Just helping with prompts. Helping so that they can actually look at the big picture. When it initially started, it was myself and another colleague who's a master's prepared nurse who's amazing at ACLS. And we would kind of alternate. And usually we would race to the code to figure out who got to be the code whisperer, because it was a very coveted job between the two of us. So that was one of our favorite jobs to do. Now it's been taken over, which is perfect, by a senior provider. And they're actually working with their resident and have an established relationship. So it works very well that they've taken this role over. We do it at times hijack that role. So if there isn't anybody present. So we can look at, and this is, there we go. And we looked at perishock pauses as well. So we looked at, okay, what were we doing beforehand and after? And this is kind of where the Code Whisperer came in as well, was to help guide the team in making sure the defibrillator was pre-charged and that we had minimal perishock and post-shock pauses. That's part of their role, is to kind of help hurry people through. We look through the filtered mode and assess whether it is a shockable rhythm. We pre-charge the defibrillator, have it ready as soon as they come off chest, then we verify in the 2 leads and then provide a shock if it's appropriate. And then we're immediately back on chest. So this was one piece that the Code Whisperer and also the recorder and the operations nurse all kind of have a little bit of a hand in to help minimize that time off chest and to make sure that we have all the pieces running synchronously so that we can provide the quickest quickest actions. We regularly do interprofessional code review, and we have a variety of attendees that attend. So it could be surgical, medical, respiratory, pharmacy, chaplain, our patient police occasionally attend, nurses, anybody that chooses to be there can be part of this interdisciplinary code review. We set it up similar to what we had with our original CodeNet for how we looked at our data, so that it really didn't diverge from what we were doing before. We're just having, it's a little harder to grasp some of the data because it's not electronic anymore. So we look at that. We assess our length of our code, the intubation status, our shocks. We look at the preceding issues. So was a patient a new transfer from a floor or from an ICU to a lower level of care? Were they a previous surgical patient? Were there compression issues? Currently, one of our most frequent issue during debriefing is documentation issues, mainly because we don't have electronic documentation and people are really frustrated by not having that available to look at. Equipment issues came up multiple times too for, okay, what's happening? What didn't work? How do we fix this? So what other options are available to improve our resuscitation outcomes? These changes that I'm going to show you came because of our interprofessional code reviews and these pieces that we picked out that were basically low-hanging fruit that we could fix right away and move on and see where we could make other incremental changes. One of them was our AM/PM code huddle. So being part of a strong team is really knowing your team, and it can change every day when you're in a teaching facility. So you may show up to a code and not know but maybe 1 or 2 people. So the code team huddle was created to make sure everybody laid eyes on who was there and what role you were going to play for the day. And then if you had to change out at all, you pass that role on to the person who was taking over your role if a code happened. It's really just a quick roll call of basically of a who's who and what are you going to do, and we'll see what a code, and hopefully we won't have one today. But it identifies your code team leader, your whisperer. This is one of our actual sheets. Of course, I took off, facility identifiers, but this is one of our actual sheets that we use and collect information on this as well. So they bring it with them and actually collect it, usually on the back of the paper when there's, if something weird happens. So our chaplain is always there too. They're part of our code team. They also wear a vocera and respond and assist with family support. We have a very wide group of people that like to participate. This also led to our crash cart standardization. So we created a hot team to revamp our crash carts. We actually purchased new carts probably about 10 years ago. Myself and a grad student actually led this big change, and my other colleague, my master's prepared colleague, led this big change for all of our facility crash carts, 70 of them, mind you. And part of this came from our partners in supply and distribution, which alerted us that every time a cart was opened, it was several $100s to send it back into service. And this was because of our inventory time to validate expiration dates, and then restock as needed. And people's time to do this, because it goes to pharmacy and then it goes to your supply and distribution to make sure the supplies are all appropriate, there when you need them and they're not expired. So we felt that was kind of strange. We're like, why do people keep opening them? We don't understand. There's no code. We haven't had a code in a couple of days, actually, or a week. Why are these broken open? So we kind of did a query of our staff and said, do you know why this keeps happening? And the staff went, well, we want to see what's in them. We need to know if we're going to use a cart, we want to know what things look like inside, what's changed. And we went, okay. So we put together a hot team and created a reference book, a little 3-ring reference book that goes with each cart. It stays with the cart. It breaks down each drawer, its contents, and the names, and if it's drugs, which specific drugs and the dosages are in there. So it's got pictures of the cart contents, and then the next page breaks down every single piece of content, and they're numbered so people can reference it by the number. Oh, number 1 is epi, got it. And they can look and see where those are. So that really took down the amount of times that the crash carts were being broken open to take a look to see what was inside. We changed the color guides every time we do an update so people know to look for a different color. This one happens to be purple, beige, and green. Like one of the other ones was a variety of blue colors, so they know if that color changes on there, that something has changed with the guide and they need to take a look at it. We also put the updated on each page so people can recognize that this is an updated cart. We also add, in case of emergency, call 911. And it seems kind of funny that people would not do that, but for some reason it got stuck in somebody's mind in some type of training that you call operator. Well, the operator answers the 911 call in-house, but you don't dial operator because you get stuck in that circular loop forever until somebody answers the phone. So we found, actually, when we were doing our debriefs, that, what do you mean it took the code team 10 minutes to get there? And they said, well, we couldn't get through on the phone. What number did you call? 0. We're like, oh dear, okay. So we had to do a re-education program of don't call 0, call 911. And so now it's on every single crash cart, on every single book, and it's throughout the facility too, so people remember that. The other thing that we did with the hot team is, if you see the little circles down here at the bottom with the down here with the triangles and the exclamation marks, we actually created a marketing branding for our emergency processes, so people recognized, oh, it's got our little circles and stuff on it. This must be emergency procedures. We should look at that. And that was something that came from the CPR committee or our emergency care committee. They recognize that this is actually a valid teaching or valid information that they need to pay attention to because it's from this committee. This is our branding right there. So this is one of the pages that looks at the defibrillators. We wanted to add notes and helpful hints in the documents too, so people could actually reference them when they had questions. And when one of the main questions was, where do we plug that round 3-lead cable into the back? There's no place to plug that. Well, it didn't make sense to people to unplug the square plug and plug in a round plug. It's you can't put a round peg in a square hole in real life. So that was really confusing to people. So we actually laid it out for you pull the cable connection, the square plug, and connect the 3-lead cable, the round plug, because underneath this is actually a round hole to put in the 3-lead cable. So once people saw that, they're like, oh, I get it. So we really leave this in as a reference of how to do this so they can look at the picture, especially new nurses. It also may be reasonable to use cognitive aids to improve team performance, and this is what the 2020 HA guidelines are looking at, and also debriefing of your rescuers. So we also changed our cognitive aids, and we add these to our little basket up here. And let's see, oh, there we go. So these are our cognitive aids. They're laminated scripts of your current 2020 guidelines. So when the operations nurse arrives, they pick up this little laminated packet, hand it to the leader, as they may be a brand new resident and have never run a code before. This is kind of their safety net of, here's my algorithm, I can read it, I can go through it, I've got this in my hands to hang on to. So it is their resource, and they do receive that once the operations nurse shows up. The other thing we did too was to add in pre-prepared numbered lab quick packs, one. So number 1 and number 2. So grab number 1 first. We thought that was kind of simple. And number 2 would be second. So your number 1, when the lab shows up, now with their iStat, they grab an ABG or VBG, hand it off to them, and they can get information readily back. And then we follow up with additional labs if they're needed. So those were easy. They didn't have to break the crash cart open, and anybody could grab those at any point. The other thing with the laminated scripts too is looking at debriefing. The pink sheet here for a hot debriefing, we have the hot pink card. And so when we do our hot team debriefs, the operations nurse says to the leader, why don't you turn to your hot pink sheet and you can lead us through the debriefing. And we want to do this because that's critical so that the staff can look at the events and sort them out, capture issues that need to be addressed, like malfunctioning equipment, pagers of OSERAs that didn't work, staff that didn't show up. We want to capture that immediately because you tend to forget that after a certain amount of time. So that was important for the lead to be able to run the team through that hot debriefing time. Other things that we added, we found challenges when we were watching our videos initially of CPR quality. So we were able to get a grant and run a resuscitation program, a resuscitation day or so. Basically, it was 24 hours of training over 3 days. So it was 8 hours a day. We called it resuscitation day because it was 24 hours worth of education. We did a quality challenge and had prizes, and everybody was very competitive, you know, of having 100% effectiveness. So we had lots of people come back through the CPR challenge multiple times. And you can see this is kind of what it looks like. This is from the National Teaching Institute, from American Association of Critical Care Nurses. I recognize the background, but this is similar to what we did. So they perform CPR with their feedback, and then they get the results for how did you do? What could you do better? How was your compression fraction? And people really enjoyed that. So that was one of our quality initiatives that we looked at. How can we improve people's activities in a code themselves? We also had a crash cart challenge too, of find 10 objects the fastest within the crash cart and see who wins. So we had prizes for that too. You gotta add in prizes too. It makes people more excited. So really, we used our data to make change, and we continue to do so today, even though our data is not as strong as we want it to be because it's not electronic. We still continue to gather what we need, and we work really hard to get to where our issues are, and it's a little bit more of a challenge, but I'm super excited for March, as hopefully that will change. We assess our strengths and our weaknesses every month as we review as a group and as an interprofessional team. And we work strongly together so that we can figure out how to make it better together. It's definitely much more challenging without our electronic system, like I said, and I'm super excited to get that back. Unless you actually track your data and analyze it, you're not going to know if there are opportunities for improvement. Without data, we're not practicing evidence-based medicine. We're reverting to our old way of doing things, which is we've always done it this way. We don't want to do that anymore. We're based on evidence. We need to use evidence to make improvements, and we need to move forward with the 21st century and get our electronic systems in place. You're successful the moment you start moving forward toward a worthwhile goal. We started this about 15 years ago, and we're still moving forward. We still have improvements to make, but we recognize that, and we're looking forward to even more improvements next year when we get all of our processes in place. Thank you so much. I'm happy to answer questions, and I've given you my Gmail address if you'd like to email.
Melissa, thank you so very much. That was a terrific presentation. Thank you so much for delivering that. If you wouldn't mind, for the Q&A, if you could stop sharing your screen.
Oh, sure.
And then we could just have a convo here for a few minutes. So for the group listening in today, again, just a reminder for questions, please enter any questions you have down at the Q&A icon there at the bottom, and we will get them answered. So Melissa, if you're ready, we can go ahead and start with some questions. So
okay.
A couple questions from from Todd Moore. He says he absolutely loves the prospect of electronic code recording and code documenting. So his understanding is that they use case review as a QI tool and really not putting that data in the patient charts. So if you incorporate CodeWriter, that's the patient care documentation, obviously will go into the patient chart. So, and also from my understanding, typically that CPR data isn't placed into the patient chart. So how do you kind of handle and deal with that part if somebody asks?
So we choose not to put that documentation in because it is QI information, and that is looking at our process improvements. We do keep it separate into another server, so we actually access that information when we're going through our code reviews. But that will, even when we move to our electronic documentation here next year, we will not be immediately adding that in, as far as I know. I would like to, once we get it maybe ironed out a little bit better so that we're actually collecting it really quite well and staff are comfortable doing that, because the last thing you want to do is put in inaccurate data because somebody didn't know how to record it appropriately and it wasn't actually filtered. So we want to make sure we have that strong process in first of filtering and making sure the data is accurate before it goes into the chart.
Got it. Okay, thank you. So great question here from Dr. Sullivan, or Diane Sullivan, I apologize. How does the code team huddle work? So that's kind of a question like a pre-COVID and a during COVID thing. Like, was it in person pre-COVID and now it's Zoom, or how are you dealing with that?
Well, it happens actually in the ICU. So people meander through actually and touch base with the charge nurse. So we're not doing a group gathering because that's not appropriate these days. I don't believe they've changed it to a Teams one, which would be much easier at this point to do that. And actually, that's a great idea. I'll actually bring that back to the team and suggest that as an option if they haven't started doing that. I've not heard that yet. And we just talked about it yesterday. But they do kind of meander and check in with the charge nurse. So the charge nurse actually lays eyes on people and then filters out to the other group at the moment. They used to actually gather in the ICU. The whole group would be there and go, hey, I see you. Okay, great. You're the RT today. Perfect. I know who to look for when I get there.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I, just like I said last week, I love that phrase of code whisper. And I didn't realize you actually had that on your sheet. So that makes it even better. That's great.
I know.
So we have a couple questions here just around if you're willing to share a couple things. So
sure.
Would you be willing to share the laminated scripts that you put out there? And then also a question around basically the slides that you did today and just some other tools that were discussed.
Oh, sure. I'm happy to share whatever people would like. That's
awesome.
Just fine.
Okay. Thank you very much. So to the group, we'll make sure to get these, make these available. How about codes outside of the ICU that aren't within the critical care space? How does debriefing kind of work with those scenarios?
We generally try to do a hot debrief while we're on site, mainly because if it is happening outside the ICU, these are uncommon events and the staff there really need that debrief and support. If you're having it in like the cath lab, the CAT scan, we have areas that rarely ever have an event. And I know we had one event in a radiology area, and the person who called it was actually a tech, I believe, and she was a little traumatized. So we wanted to make sure that debrief happened right there so we could support her and provide her with resources as well. And so I checked back in with her the next day as well to make sure and debrief a little bit more if she needed it. There are times you can't do it. If the patient is, you get ROSC and then you need to get them to the ICU. So we will invite people back up to the ICU and try to do the debrief at that point. COVID has made it a little bit more difficult again, but that's our goal, is to do it on site, at least something. And what I do tell them is take your pink script, just run through it. We need 3 minutes or less. And then I want everybody to just email if you think of other things, but we need to keep this quick and dirty, get it done, and then we can follow up with more information if needed.
Great. And you kind of briefly mentioned this, and this question hasn't come through our Q&A, but it's just something that I'd like to ask, is you referenced that kind of the emotional impact this has on caregivers, especially those that, don't deal with this often at all. How do you integrate that piece into the overall debrief?
We provide them the emotional support to talk through. So what happened? How did that make you feel? It sounds like you're taking a lot of this personally. So tell me, what would you have done differently if you had that opportunity? A lot of times there's nothing they could have done differently, and we need to just reinforce you did exactly what you needed to. That patient survived because of what you did. You need to not internalize this. It's a traumatic event. We need to walk through this and help you for if it happens again. You did the right thing. I would want you to do the same thing next time. So we also have a support team that provides emotional support too, and they can be activated like through the ethics, through social work, through the chaplaincy, and the chaplains do come to the codes as well. So they can stay back. If we have somebody who's really struggling, the chaplain will stay back and provide support with them.
That's great. So
excellent chaplains.
Yeah, and that's so very important, obviously, especially if it's an arrest that is completely unexpected. That makes it that much harder emotionally to deal with. So thank you for that. So just getting back to the data a little bit. So how did staff, when you first started this program a while ago and you gathering all this data and you started to share the data with the staff, how did they first perceive it?
Before we actually shared the data, we would ask people, so where do you think we're having issues? No, I think we run things pretty well. No, I don't think we.
Yeah, of course.
We do great.
Right. Yeah.
And then we could, there were opportunities to share where we had maybe not as done as well as we thought we could. One example was the time for shock in an ICU was 7 minutes, and it was a shockable rhythm identified at the start. So that was a real learning opportunity, and people realized, wow, how did we miss this? So they were more open to listening to, though I guess, maybe we do have some things to improve upon, and this can help us do that. So sometimes it's a little painful, but growth can be painful.
Absolutely. And I think, and I'm sure you'll agree, the biggest part sometimes is that objective data, right? It's not subjective. I think you did well, or, I feel you did well, or whatever it may be. It's that true objective data that you can kind of refer people back to.
Yeah,
sure.
Exactly.
So this is a question that comes up, and I'm sure everybody in all facilities deal with this in terms of debriefing. So kind of between hot and cold debriefs, one of the big issues is obviously when a patient gets transferred, right? So how would you conduct that hot debrief if a patient gets transferred, when everybody's kind of moving around and thinking of the patient, right, and where they're moving to? How do you deal with that?
Oftentimes we'll have a team that can peel off and take the patient up to the higher level of care, wherever that might be. So that smaller team can peel off and do that. And we try to maintain the group that's there at least for 3 minutes to do some type of debrief, and if we can't do that for a variety of reasons, then we do try to obtain names so that we can come back to people and say, hey, I just want to touch base with you. We want to get some feedback. What worked, what didn't work, and what would you have done differently if looking back on it now. So we do try to follow up with that. There are times where it really doesn't work. As much as we want it to happen, we still get no, there was no hot debrief done. We had to run to the ICU. So, and you just roll with it and make it work from there.
Well, it sounds like you have a plan in place, and it's great when you say all I need is 3 minutes of your time, so people know it's just a very short amount of time. So if there's any chance to get it done, people look at 3 minutes and say, I think I can do that.
Okay, I can handle that. Yeah,
right.
If you tell them we're going to debrief for 20 minutes, they're like, oh, heck no.
No chance. Right, exactly. That's great. So this next one comes from Betty Goodwin. So CPR challenge sounds great, and I can actually say I agree. I've been in many. They are great. So what data did you collect and share? And then kind of as a follow-up to that, did you collect it and share it in, well, not collect it, but share it in real time? Or was it, an event kind of down the road that you shared it with the clinicians?
So the data that we did collect was really looking at how things changed with the CPR challenge. How did people perform and how many did we have performing at the high levels? So that was good information to give back to leadership. For the most part, people are doing good compressions and they're doing what we need, and they could find things in the crash carts. So the information we kind of took back from that, and I kicked myself at the moment, and before too, of I wish we had collected more strong data. We did do a pre and a post test. But I wish we'd collected additional data so that we could have published better information. We collected enough to provide leadership for why this was a good event, how the training improved. And honestly, a couple of the volunteers came in and did the CPR challenge and also the crash cart challenge, which was kind of interesting because they would never be into a crash cart. But one of our volunteers was probably at the top of the list. He was like number 1, 2, or 3. I think he was number 3 on his CPR challenge. So I'm like, woohoo! I really am happy having you as a volunteer.
Sure, absolutely.
If anybody goes down, I'm pulling you first. He's like, oh, okay. So
That's great.
He was pretty excited. So it was more ad hoc data, and then we also did present to leadership to let them know, this is what we provided. This is how we utilized our time, our money, the grant that we received. And I do have other data. It's just, it's been so long now. I probably should go back and refresh on that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those CPR challenges, they are fun. I think everybody needs to know that they do end up being fun because people are competitive and they want to, they want to improve. So it's a fun way to see how you do. So.
Oh yeah, I went through it several times myself. And the other thing we did with the resuscitation challenge is we brought in speakers to talk about end-of-life issues. So we brought in speakers to talk about resuscitation, distress, being the provider or being one of the responders that's in there. So we had 15 to 30-minute talks that people could actually sit through and get more information about, how do I handle this myself? How do I deal with the moral distress as I'm a CPR responder, as I'm a code blue responder?
Interesting, very interesting. So on that same topic of a code team, so does your team have designated code team roles, or are they assigned at the time of the event?
No, they are designated. So the morning you receive on your Vocera, so we use Vocera for communication for our codes. They choose which role they're going to take. They assign themselves to the code blue team, so it's just a generic team, but they know their roles. So one person will be operations, another person will be Visual, will be IV placement or IO placement. Our pharmacist hands everything from our crash cart. So they manage the crash cart. We don't touch it. We try not to, but we do at times. They've also had their own training too of where things are. What do I need to hand? How do I need to prepare things? How do I need to do faster? So that they can be a really strong member, and they are, of our code team. So the pharmacist, has their little domain of, this is my crash cart, don't touch it. What do you need? And they find it, hand it off. And then operations will kind of help coordinate what activities are going on too. So people are assigned into their roles, and it varies occasionally, especially if it's very long code. Like recorder will get handed off occasionally. I know when I show up at times, I'll take over recorder if they need to be doing something else.
Gotcha. Okay, but it sounds like for the most part, folks know what their role is going into it.
Yes.
So just kind of go from there.
Great. Very much.
Great. So you have obviously made quite a few changes just based on the data you've been able to obtain. So what were some of the main challenges that you ran into, roadblocks, if you will, with implementing these changes?
Anytime you make change, there's distress because, change is bad. None of us like to change a whole lot. And so, that had its own challenges there. I think going to electronic was probably one of the hardest ones I've ever dealt with. Mainly because I had comments of, we just need a better pencil and paper system. I'm like, Oh.
Did you just say that?
Was that your out loud voice? Like, put it back in. So, and I was a programmer in a former life, so before I was a nurse. So I was like, no, we're going, the computer, it is our friend. We will be one with the computer. We are going electronic. We will make this work. So that in itself, going electronic was, it was a very big challenge, but we made it work. And we had to make a lot of concessions, a lot of changes through the way, along the way, to make it functional. And then, of course, about the time we're getting the idea of how to do everything, it dies. I'm like,
goodness.
No, it's like one of my worst days. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me.
Yeah, it sounds like it, and I can imagine you had so much data there, right?
Mhm.
So that's challenging for sure. You gotta love computer and technology issues.
The other one was the operations nurse, I have to say, because the staff actually came up with that. A few of the staff did, and they helped roll that out we think we really need this person. We need this person to help out with the other nurses and make sure we're all doing the right thing. So that was fantastic to see the staff buy in on that, and that they recognized we can make improvements and we can have an effect on the outcomes. So that's probably one of my most heartwarming, that their engagement actually drove this big change.
Yeah, that's terrific. That really is. So let's see here. What would be, in your opinion, the most influential pieces of information that you could really utilize to help improve an institution's clinical outcomes?
Your peri and post-shock pauses are critical. Early on, we found, and I didn't show some of this data, but we could find that we were off the chest, for minutes at a time. Yeah, and really, when that data was when we figured that out, people were horrified because the team really didn't recognize. I mean, you get into a time warp when you're at an event like that, and you don't realize how much time has passed. It either goes really slow when you're waiting for the code team to arrive, or it just goes lickety split as soon as the code team's there and everything's happening. So they didn't realize that time was so, that they had that much time off chest. So it was really, okay, how do we look at this information to make sure we're really narrowing that gap on how much time is off? Also, your compressions too, your compression fraction. That's really it, is, you've got to have good compressions. At times we have a metronome. We've talked about adding it to the group. Somebody has it on their phone almost always. Early on, I had a few people sing Staying Alive. So be like, okay, sing with me.
Yeah.
They're like, what?
Kind of morbid, right?
Yeah. Well, the morbid one would be Another One Bites the Dust.
That is very true. You got me. Yeah. Very true.
Yeah, frown on that one.
Yeah.
Staying Alive is perfect. They really don't want me to sing though. So metronome, so your compression fraction and your time off chest, and also making sure you've got your initial shock in, because like I had mentioned, that was an issue for us. And so recognizing how long does it take to get that first shock in, and it's a little squishy if you're in an outpatient area, or not an outpatient, but in a non-ICU area. Where's the time start? How do you know how long the patient's been dead? How do you know how long they've been in VFib? So what is that time to first shock really? Is it when you put the pads on? So we get a little squishy with that information too.
Gotcha. Okay. Just like what the AHA says, early defibrillation, high quality compressions, and stay on the chest as long as you can, right?
Yep.
And that's really what it comes down to. Terrific.
That's what it comes down to.
Terrific.
Just the mechanics.
Absolutely. So that looks like it's all the questions we have. So if you wouldn't mind, Melissa, could you share just your screen with your email on it again? And
sure.
For those of you folks, and Melissa, if this is okay with you, that would like some of the information that Melissa discussed today, if you wouldn't mind, Melissa, if it's okay with you, if they could reach out direct to you, just with, requests of some of the information you shared.
Oh, absolutely. I'm happy to answer them.
Perfect. So thank you for that. So we can just leave this slide up for a minute or so everybody can grab Melissa's email address. And in the meantime, again, Melissa, just really wanted to thank you for your time today, for your contribution to this masterclass series. I think your presentation was terrific. So thank you again for the presentation, for the Q&A. Again, out to the whole group listening in today. I've said this a few times and I'll say it again because we really mean it. All of us at Zola really do thank each of you for your continuing commitment to helping all of us through this pandemic. We know you're all working on the front lines and putting your lives at risk, so we all thank you for that. We truly hope you found today's session beneficial, the 4-part webinar series beneficial, and we really hope you can take some bits of it, apply it in your own institutions, and help yourselves all progress as well. So if there are no further questions, we can go ahead and say goodbye for today. Thank you guys all for your time. We again really hope you found this beneficial. And again, Melissa, thank you for your time. Terrific presentation. And it was great to be here with everybody today.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Take care.